particular towns, along particular streets. And as the pathogen moved from tree to tree, it killed these trees until we're where we are now, where Dutch elm is still around, but it's an incredibly rare tree. And what we've gone to is this more kind of uniform dispersion where trees are far enough apart where the likelihood that the pathogen can move between them is closer to zero. So you could imagine starting out with a dispersion that looked more like this. Right? Clumps. And as individuals get infected, they begin to affect other trees and so on. And what begins to happen then is the only elms that survive are the ones that are far enough away from each other where the likelihood of transmission is close to zero. Pathogens and parasites, if they cause negative effects on individuals, and they do because by definition it's a consumer resource interaction, if they cause these negative effects for organisms, they should begin to alter the dispersion of individuals in space. It pushes for a dispersion where individuals are much more separated from each other and don't tend to be aggregated or clumped. Now, I know that you probably have an idea of this already, right? I mean, the whole idea behind social distancing with the coronavirus is to try to remove these clumps of individuals where the pathogen can move very quickly between individuals and try to get people far enough apart, right, dispersed enough in space that you lessen the likelihood of transmission. Excuse me. You lessen the likelihood of transmission. Okay? All right. One more concept to go, and then we're into the community ecology stuff. I'm not spending as much time on these species interactions other than competition because in EBE you got a pretty hefty dose of them. But I do want to mention something about commensalism because we don't talk about that one at all in EBE, really. This is an interaction where one species derives a benefit by being around a second species, but the second species has no idea that the first species is even there, right? There's this weird type of interaction where the two species, it's kind of asymmetric. One gains a benefit and one has no idea that anything's going on. So we might expect these commensalist relationships to begin to occur, that species 1 might preferentially associate with species 2 because of that derived benefit, and because it doesn't affect species 2 in any kind of appreciable way, our expectation is that species 2 should tolerate this interaction, right? There's no natural selection working on individuals that prevent or promote that interaction. Now the thinking is that at some point during evolutionary time, excuse me, this interaction begins to change a little bit. And the nature of this change is a genetic change. So if species 1 is deriving this benefit from species 2, if at some point species 2 begins to derive a benefit from species 1, then our commensalist relationship can begin to change to one of mutualism. Okay? Now, our expectation is that this benefit to species 2 is a chance benefit, but once it occurs, if there's a genetic basis to this interaction by species 2, then those individuals that promote the interaction and gain the benefit gain in terms of natural selection, while those that avoid the interaction and gain a benefit would lose in terms of natural selection. So our expectation is commensalistic relationships can, under certain circumstances, convert to these mutualistic relationships. And now that we have a mutualistic relationship, this relationship begin to change a little bit more. Initially, both species are fine on their own, right? They can live apart from each other. This is the beginnings of this mutualistic relationship. And when they're together, they do a lot better. But when they're apart from each other, everything is still fine. This type of mutualism is called a facultative mutualism, right? That same kind of language you'd use in micro about facultative anaerobes, right? You could do it, you could not do it, it doesn't really matter. So this is a facultative mutualism. Now, the two species are benefiting each other. There's something that's being done by species 1 to benefit species 2, and there's something being done by species 2 to benefit species 1. Now, over time, we have a weird situation where the two species are allocating resources for various life functions. Okay? Species 1 has a particular allocation of resources. Species 2 has a particular allocation of resources. They're allocating resources toward survivorship and reproduction, and these allocations have an effect on their fitness. We expect these allocations to be worked on over evolutionary time toward allocations that represent the best fit with the organism and the environment. But at some point, species 1 and species 2 are working together, but they are duplicating particular functions. For example, they both may be allocating resources to a function that's currently being done by the other. Is that okay? Excuse me. These allocations to resources, species 1 is allocating and species 2 is allocating. Okay? Now, if by chance an individual in the population did not allocate resources to this function, but instead allocated these resources to other functions, this individual would be favored by natural selection. It's not wasting resources on something that the other species is doing. Instead, what's happening is it's diverting those resources into other functions. And now, in a sense, it's gotten a boost to these other functions that it wouldn't otherwise have done, and it's no longer wasting resources on a function that's duplicated by the second species. Now, natural selection will push for this. I said last time natural selection does not look far ahead. Well, there is a danger to giving up the ability to do something, right? You're losing the ability to fend for yourself or provide resources for yourself or survive in certain ways or reproduce in certain ways. And by giving up that function, you're now locked into a different kind of mutualism, because for you, you can no longer be separated from species 2. If you are separated from species 2, well, now you can't do this function anymore. You're going to die. So this type of an interaction here is still a mutualism, but it's now of the form of what we call an obligate mutualism. Now, the way I drew things, species 1 over here is part of an obligate mutualism because species 2 does this thing that species 1 can no longer do. Natural selection selected for it to not do that anymore because it was a duplication of function. Species 2, on the other hand, is still doing everything it needs to do. So from its perspective, it's a facultative mutualism. And from species 1's perspective, it's an obligate mutualism. Okay? Let's do a quick example of that. We have coral. So we're going to do commensalism, to mutualism, that's facultative, to mutualism, which is obligate. Okay? So I have coral here. Coral is made up of these individual structures called polyps. And within these coral polyps, I have two organisms. The first is an animal, which is called a cnidarian, and the second one is an alga, typically a zooxanthellae, I think is the group. It's a typical mutualism in that the alga gains a benefit by being associated with the cnidarian, because the cnidarian can build this little calcium carbonate shell that protects the alga. So the alga gains from this relationship in the form of protection. It's less likely to be eaten if it's inside one of these polyps than if it's out there growing on the coral surface, okay, or floating free in a water column. The cnidarian is gaining because the alga does photosynthesis, and because the alga does photosynthesis, it gives the cnidarian photosynthate in exchange for this protected home that it lives in. Now, from the alga's perspective, this is a facultative mutualism. If the algae that are inside that coral polyp are ejected and end up out here, they can be free living. Their fitness may not be as high because they're susceptible to predation. Here they're protected from predation, but they're free living. So for them, whether they're in the coral polyp or they're free on their own, they can still survive. So for them, this is a facultative mutualism. On the other hand, for the cnidarian, when the alga is gone, the cnidarian can no longer make its own, right? It can no longer get the photosynthase from the alga, and whatever bits and pieces it brings in through filter feeding are not enough to meet the current demands. So for the cnidarian, this relationship is obligate, and for the alga, it's facultative. Okay? Doing all right so far? Right. As an aside, I'm sure that you're aware of this, but when the alga are gone from the coral polyp, the death of the coral is called bleaching because the coral turns white as part of the death process. Is that okay? And then there are different factors that promote this kind of disassociation of the alga from the cnidarian. Things like amount of light that can be affected by turbidity, depth of water, temperature has an effect on this as well. But in any event, since we're talking about the mutualisms, this is an example of over evolutionary time. It probably started out as a commensal relationship. They were just kind of together. Maybe the alga got protection from the coral, but wasn't yet giving photosynthase, but the coral didn't really, or the cnidarian didn't really know the alga was there. And then over time, the coral began to not kind of spend as much time foraging for food and use those resources to build the shell, and then the alga provided the photosynthase, and here we are at this weird situation where for one of them it's obligate and for one of them it's facultative. Now, if this situation were to continue over evolutionary time, my expectation is at some point, if there's a function that the algae perform that the cnidarian also perform as well, and there's an excess of benefit, that you would select for algae that stopped doing certain processes that the cnidarian did, in which case you could move to a situation where both species are in this obligate mutualism. They require each other to the point where without each other, they're not going to make it. Okay? Now, these obligate mutualisms can go a step further, and I'm not quite sure what to call this step, but this step has been very important in the development of life on the planet. The thinking is that at some point in the past, there was this bacterium, and this bacterium was capable of photosynthesis. Okay? Now, this photosynthetic bacterium that could do photosynthesis, there's also out there another bacterium here that was capable of doing a weird kind of metabolism that used oxygen as a final electron acceptor. We can't call it cellular respiration because that's a prokaryote, but it is a process that pretty much does the same thing. It makes lots of ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. Now I have this eukaryotic cell here, and at some point we think the eukaryotic cell took up the bacterium, probably through kind of phagocytosis, phagocytic process, and brought in this bacterium inside a little vesicle. Now, I've got two membranes here, and then for some reason this didn't fuse with the lysosome, and this bacterium began to continue to do this oxygen as a final electron acceptor trick. And as it did that, it generated lots of ATP, and the cell begins to benefit from this additional ATP. This eukaryotic cell is very good at bringing in resources, and maybe is better at bringing in resources than the bacteria was. And these resources that are being brought into this eukaryotic